minutes. 10 minutes to start, right? Yeah. If you have a second camera, I mean, if it's possible to use a second one, it's great to get, because splicing in is key. Yeah, so if you could do that, that'd be awesome. Thank you. Yeah, that way we can kind of go from different angles and close-ups. Well, yeah, that's great. Thank you. San Francisco this afternoon, or this evening. No, from Great. Okay. Okay, good, great. All right.
Thank you, Will.
Who is this? Taco Phillips, BP, Arco.
Yeah, well, I think that would be
Very different. Yeah.
I'm not ready. Understood. Normally wouldn't, but let's do it.
Really? All right.
Please, yeah.
It's okay.
Good. I don't think it's me though. I think it's Coca-Cola. What are they? Aren't they that company in India? Aren't they that? Oh man. Let's see what that guy's got to say. Man, is that what college does? It just gets you, right on time. Everything quiets down. It never happened when I was in college. So I think we have a couple more minutes before we'll start. So get ready. Cell phones off. Blood sugar up for the next hour and 15. Will you signal me when you think it's time to go? Ready to go? All right, welcome everyone. Welcome back from lunch. Welcome to an exciting afternoon. We'll have a good discussion for you. Reminder: cell phones off at the beginning of the session. Here, This is about the water imperative, how better access to water improves lives and improves markets. We have a very interesting panel of experts from different perspectives, and we're going to have a discussion this afternoon about that topic. And I invite you to get ready to get involved in that discussion. I'm Bill Shireman. I'm president of Future 500. We are a nonprofit that brings together groups that love to hate and demonize one another. Conservatives and liberals, Tea Partiers and occupiers, and above all, the world's largest corporations and its most impassioned activist groups. We work to bring peace between groups that tend to be rather hardcore, hard-hitting, the Greenpeaces, the Rainforest Action Networks, the Amnesties, and Oxfams, and many others, and the companies that they are often engaged with, increasingly in positive ways. So we've worked between Rainforest Action Network and the Mitsubishi companies to save forests in Indonesia. We've worked between Coca-Cola and Genocide Intervention Network to help promote human rights in the Sudan, and a lot of other issues. Increasingly, water is a focus of the work that we do. Water is increasingly regarded as a human right, but a different kind of human right than the right to free speech or press or religious practice. Water is a limited resource, and therefore, if you are guaranteeing free access to water for some, you may be restricting free access to water for others. And that is a frightening prospect in a world where about a third of the population is likely to be in water shortage and scarcity in 15 to 20 years. And that 1/3 of the population is not just folks in the developing world, it is folks right here in this room, folks in the United States. The water shortages that we will face could impact supplies of food and certainly prices for food here in the States, an inconvenience and a difficulty for us, a matter of potentially life and death for many of the people who are at the bottom billion and the bottom 2 billion around the world. So, human rights groups and NGO groups are worried about what we may face, and they are worried that corporations are locking up the world's water, privatizing that water, potentially holding it hostage for the time when they need it in competition with others who may need it. And they're demanding that companies declare that water is a human right and that they take action to assure that folks have access to water. The biggest brands are often the biggest targets in this, and that's why we wanted to make sure that we had folks who have gone through the gauntlet on this issue and who know it well. Coca-Cola is a visible symbol of water use, and one that is often popularly used in this issue. And as a consequence, over the last 10 years and more, I've seen them become a veritable human United Nations of water projects. It's astonishing in some ways the number of different water projects and initiatives that Coca-Cola has gotten into. We have Jeff Seabright from the Coca-Cola Company, really the leader in sustainability across many fields within Coke, and you'll enjoy hearing from him. Merck is, of course, leader in the pharmaceutical world. Their objective as a company is to promote the health and welfare of the people and communities that they serve. They want to make sure that water use in their operations is clean and safe, and that water is accessible in their communities for their employees and for the people that they serve. And we have Maggie Kohn, the Director of Corporate Responsibility from Merck, here to join us today. Conservation International, one of the largest and most successful conservation organizations in the world, is involved in helping companies to find sustainable paths in many areas, in food and water and agriculture. We'll hear how they have helped companies ranging from large brands like Starbucks and Coke to folks in the energy sector to take hold of this issue. So I want to just start out with a question, and I'll direct this to Jeff, but I invite Maggie and Marielle Canter Weikel, sorry for missing the introduction, who is the Director of Corporate Freshwater Strategies at CI. I want to start with Jeff and ask you, what's ahead? What's the scope of the water problem as you see it?
Thanks, Bill. I mean, I think it's first important to note that water is really at the heart of sort of the whole nexus of sustainable development. If you think about agriculture, which is, 70% of water use, economic productivity, ecosystem services, gender impacts, human health, crisis and crisis response, emergency response. Water is really at the heart of the challenges, and increasingly it's at the heart of some of the conflicts. Bill mentioned Sudan earlier. That's arguably a conflict that is born out of water scarcity. And the U.S. intelligence community recently published an unclassified version of a classified report on the national security implications of the water challenges around the world. So it's an issue that has gotten, I think, growing attention in the business community, in the government community, and in the public policy domain. The challenge is, as Bill said, it's a finite resource. It's renewable, but it is finite, and it is a resource that's under growing stress from increasing demographic and economic growth pressures on the one hand, and climate change on the other, and I'll talk a little bit more about that very briefly. And as a result of these sort of growing pressures on water in places where the population, the demographic pressures are greatest in emerging markets and in other areas, in my own hometown of Atlanta, we have some serious water issues, is that the McKinsey Group did a piece of analysis in partnership with the World Bank and various others called the Water Resources 2030. And their analysis showed a 40% shortfall between available supply based on current trajectories and effective demand by 2030. A 40% shortfall, and much of that in emerging markets. So there is a real gap emerging between supply, demand, and equity issues and how we address that. And I think one of the important things is that we are not going to be able to really solve this water challenge on its own. It's linked to food and agriculture, as Bill alluded to, and it's intimately linked with energy. And so the sort of food, energy, water nexus, increasingly stressed by the demographic and economic growth, the billion-plus middle-class consumers, increasing demands on protein, et cetera, and climate change. And just last comment on climate. I mean, climate is, the water is the medium through which climate impacts are manifest, because the water cycle is the regulator of our planet. And so when we have a net increase in the average global temperatures, you see this manifest in terms of more extreme weather events, greater droughts, et cetera. So the unpredictability and volatility that is occurring as a result of climate change, and I believe it's occurring today and is likely to be accelerating, is going to create some further challenges and real volatility in the water side of the equation.
Marielle, Maggie, do you have anything to add? Don't feel you have to.
I think it was pretty thorough.
Yeah.
The only thing I think I will add is that, not only are businesses starting to wake up and notice and look at this from a risk perspective, but what I think is very important is you're starting to see Wall Street. You're starting to see the investors really wake up. And folks may have seen this week on Wednesday, the Carbon Disclosure Project also does a initiative on water where they ask companies to disclose their water use, their water risk. Been doing it now, I think, for 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And it came out this week, and I was surprised. It was signed by 350, I think, investors. And I wrote this down because it was so large, who manage over $43 trillion in assets. So when Wall Street is starting to look at an issue, it's acute. So I think that's all I will add at this point.
Right. Well, the title of this session is how better access to water improves lives and markets. But that's a little bit of a question mark. Why is the public's access to water something that's important to companies like Coke and companies like Merck? What's the business case for you to be involved to make sure that other people have water? Maggie?
Sure, I can start. And it's sometimes difficult. I get a lot of questions about, well, why is water important to Merck? It's a little more obvious with a company like Coke or an agriculture company that water plays an enormous part in their supply chain. Merck obviously is a user of water, but at lesser quantities. It really became apparent to us about 2 years ago as we started looking at our environmental sustainability strategy. And we did, I think, what most companies of our size do. We went through that. And so that's all fine and good, and that, is I think, standard practice. But as a healthcare company, our motto is to help the world be well. And our business model is increasingly moving into emerging markets. So we're moving into India, and we're moving into China, into Brazil. And as we sit down with ministries of health, we'll sit down with them and we'll talk about how can we partner with you to help address your most serious health issues. And then we typically start to talk to them about our products, our vaccines, our HIV medicines. And time again, our senior leaders would hear from these ministries of health, I don't want to talk about your products. My main health challenge is lack of access to clean water. I have millions of kids dying in my country because they cannot get access to clean water. So those types of conversations really started to cause some discussion internally, and said, if we are really true to our mission and our values, we need to help these countries address their most urgent health needs. So we took some time. We didn't have a lot of expertise in water outside from manufacturing operations. We connected with a lot of good NGOs. We actually connected with Coke in India and are doing some partnership work with them there. And have started some projects. It's in the very early pilot phase right now because we are so new to this. But that was really how we made the business case, is that it was so core to our business. And until we address these underlying health challenges in these emerging markets, it's going to be very hard to move on to other challenges that our product base does have relevance for.
Now we've got a company. Do you have a comment? We've got a soft drink company, or a beverage company, I guess they call it now. Sorry, and I'm 20 years, 30 years out of date on this. So, and we have a pharmaceuticals company. But 80%, 70%, 80% of the water that we use is in agriculture. 90% of the pollution comes from agriculture. Energy development is an increasing user of water. To make a single gallon of biodiesel, it takes 9,100 gallons of water. That's a heavy appetite. What's the difference between a symbolic approach to water conservation and efficiency and systemic approaches that actually make a difference? Marielle?
Well, I might just start with talking a little bit about one concept that's gaining a lot of traction to help illustrate this idea that you're getting at, called water footprinting. So a lot of the companies we work with at CI, and we work across a range of industries, both the food and ag, also energy, oil and gas and mining, and a number of other sectors. And a concept that's really gained a lot of traction of late is the water footprint concept. And this is really a way for companies to help better understand what across their value chain, what both the very clear water within their products, such as a drink like this, and the ounces of water that are in this product, but also the water that's embedded within their supply chain back to the farm, where, as you were just mentioning, 70% of water use tends to happen. So I think that's a good illustration of one of the symbolic concepts that companies are using, that we're working with to try and get back to more systemic approaches at, for example, with our food and ag partners at the farm level. So we're working with Coca-Cola and some of our other partners on their sustainable ag principles and sourcing guidelines to embed concepts like water conservation, and a variety of different ways in which they're impacting water resources, to lessen and reduce the amount of water that they're using, and also the impact that use like pesticides and other things are having on waterways.
Now, one of the lessons I learned as a young activist a couple of decades ago was that companies have supply chains, and they have leverage over those supply chains. And the higher up you are in the supply chain, the more leverage you have, and the more activist you are as an organization, the more you can influence some of those companies high up in the supply chain, which brings us to Coca-Cola. How does a company like Coca-Cola implement some of these supply chain standards for water in agriculture?
Great question, and it is a growing focus for us, and I think for most companies, is really looking at this sort of full value chain approach to end-to-end management. In our case, for example, a global average for our beverages is for the actual production of the beverages at about 2.1 liters to generate a liter of product, and that other liter is used in rinsing and washing and what have you for refillable glass and other things. But that's just in the manufacturing sites. But if we include the water, embedded water used in the agricultural ingredients, primarily sugar and sweeteners, it turns out to be 70 liters, for a liter of Coca-Cola. And as we trace that water trail back, we're doing work, with the sugar industry, with WWF, represented here in the room today, and Solidaridad and others, around setting the first standard for sustainable sugarcane cultivation and production called Bon Sucro. And we were very pleased to certify, or have received the first certified, sustainably certified sugar last year in Brazil, and we're working to expand that across our value chain, and we buy a lot of sugar. But we're also working with farmers in China around improving agricultural practices, including water conservation. We're working with farmers in the U.S. on corn. So lots of different efforts to engage through our supply chain, working with the agro-industrial companies like Cargill, and in turn through their suppliers and the suppliers of their suppliers, to really get at this challenge of how we can really change agricultural practices.
What's and I don't want to focus on you, Jeff, but what you say brings up a topic. A company like Coca-Cola, targeted often because it has a product that has water in it, and obviously is an easy target for some. To what extent is the activism that may negatively target a company productive in bringing about a change?
Yeah.
You guys have become real strong drivers for change throughout agriculture, much beyond your place in the market. What's the role of negative activism, and what's the role of positive activism in driving that kind of change?
Great question, and we certainly have a big brand, so we make it an attractive target if you want to get attention. We call it brand jacking sometimes, and many of you, I suppose, may have read some case studies about the issues in India that we faced in 2002 and 2003, which were sort of a classic case study of a corporate sort of challenge. And I came into the company just when that was really hitting its peak. And I think we were able to, and I'm quite proud of this, I think, rather than being reactive and defensive, although there was an element of that initially, I think it's fair to say, we were able to actually try to take that crisis and learn from it. And that was a painful process. It was a scary process for many of our executives. But in the end, one that made our company, I think, much, much stronger. So, as we got into this, not only did we do an exhaustive review of the water issues across our global operations, and we have 1,000 bottling plants in 200 countries, so it's no small matter to undertake that kind of an effort. And the result of that was a recognition that if we need to really look beyond the four walls of our manufacturing operations, which is traditionally where we focused: water quality, water efficiency, wastewater treatment. Those were things that plant managers were, pretty comfortable doing. It was a pretty standard kind of thing at Coke. And what we learned was that the water sheds that supply our business and support the communities are very critical, and we need to understand what's happening in the ecosystems, the watersheds, nature's water factories. That's why we formed a great partnership with WWF, who've helped us on that journey. And then to learn much more about the social use, the community aspect of water, because it is the ultimate shared resource, the common good, and how to make sure that we're understanding and engaging with local stakeholders so that these issues of competition of our use of water versus the community doesn't come into play ever again, that's something that we need to work on. And so we've built muscles around those capabilities that we didn't have before, and really understanding and respecting water as a social good, and understanding the importance of it in terms of the natural capital that it represents, for our business. So that's been a very positive learning process that we've gone through as a result of India.
I'll ask you one more question about this, and that is, as we work with different stakeholder groups on these issues, I think in the last decade, groups have become much more sophisticated and effective in not just attacking a company forever, but actually attacking, gaining ground, and then rewarding the company with positive attention. Even groups like Greenpeace, Rainforest Action Network will regularly target a company, get some progress, and then put out a press release that praises them for making a change. Other organizations, though, seem to grab on forever, and they will kind of just stay with an issue and keep that initial battle going as long as they can. How do you see these different groups, and how do you decide how to engage with groups that are taking these two different approaches?
Well, I mean, I think there are some who do focus on this and will never want to support a corporate or acknowledge that a corporate actor can be a force for positive change, and we understand that, and it is what it is. We actually had a very interesting situation with Greenpeace. This doesn't directly answer your question, but a campaign was run against Coca-Cola at the Sydney Olympics in 2000, and our chairman at the time, CEO, happened to be Australian, so he took it quite personally, about our use of F-gases, hydrofluorocarbons in refrigeration, and this is a big issue for Greenpeace, and HFCs are a very potent greenhouse gas. And they ran a Killer Coke campaign very visibly in Sydney, and our CEO said, well, let's meet with Greenpeace and figure out what this is all about. And we sat down with Gerard Leipold, the head of Greenpeace, and within a matter of weeks, we agreed that we would phase out HFCs. And I did a joint interview at BSR many, many years ago with Gerard Leipold from Greenpeace, and for the first time he said, we were really disappointed in that because we were expecting this campaign to run for a good year, 18 months.
We got the 3-year grant cycle.
You took the sting right out of it, and it really pissed me off. It kind of works both ways when you can wrong-foot each other that way. But I mean, on the issues that we're talking about here today, water, I think, one of the things that we came to view at Coke was that water is symbolic. It is highly emotive. It is, a religious, symbol in many, or if not most cultures. It has tremendous emotional sort of context. And it is not just a physical substance. It's not just a commodity, and it is filled with all of this meaning. That we are going to be, kind of in the crosshairs for people who have an issue on this, and we're not going to be able to change what people may say. But what we can do is transcend the issue by going to school and really learning about it and putting ourselves in a position of leadership and trying to drive meaningful change everywhere we operate, right? So that we have real proof points. And today we have over 400 projects in about 90 countries working on watershed conservation and safe water access, helping provide safe drinking water to millions of people that didn't have it just a few years ago, and working on critical ecosystems around the world. So,
when I was a kid and growing up and looking at these issues, I thought of air as something that is freely available to me and should be freely available, and water as something that should be freely available to me. And yet, one of the systemic drivers of the water problem is that water is freely available to also the agricultural sector and the energy sector. And for the price of extracting it, if you have water rights, there's no payment to society at large for drawing forth the water. What's the role of subsidies? What's the role of externalized costs in this, and who should pay the full costs of water? Marielle or Maggie?
I'm willing to weigh in, although I'll just say up front, I'm not going to precisely answer your question, so apologies in advance for that. I mean, I think, in my personal experience living here in Baltimore, it's a great illustration of prices not being appropriately calibrated. I think I pay something like 7 cents a day per person in my family for water here, and to me, that's just ridiculous. I mean, there's no way that the treatment of the water our family uses and the delivery mechanisms, sewage treatments can be, adequately covered with that kind of pricing. But that said, I mean, I will say a huge amount of attention in the work that we're doing now at CI with corporate partners like Coke and others, Starbucks and others, is to start looking at the value that we place on ecosystem services, including the water that we derive from nature, natural capital valuation. These are really hot trending topics, and areas where we are spending a lot of time with our corporate partners these days. And really it comes down to better quantifying these attributes, these things that nature provides us, including clean water, and ascribing a true value to them in terms of, not just pricing, but appropriately accounting for the services that nature provides. So just one example I'll provide, Vale, a mining company that is here, and you may have heard one of their representatives speak earlier today. We've been working with them in Brazil to basically value in monetary terms, after quantifying it, the value that some of the areas that they've set aside there place in terms of quantity of water and what that means in dollar values to downstream cities in Brazil. So it was something like $1.8 million. I'm not sure over what time frame, but pretty significant. So companies are getting savvy on this issue, and we're working quite a bit, I would say, these days in trying to better quantify, because from our vantage point, from the NGO vantage point, dollars are the sort of transactional language for the private sector, and ways in which we can sort of help better and more adequately value the commodity of water.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's no question that the value of water is just not reflected in the price. That's not to say that big volume users shouldn't get a discount, but I think something has to change. The incentives have to be restructured. And it reminds me of this quote by Mark Twain, which I'm sure I'm going to butcher, but so if anyone else knows it, you can say it. But it's comparing the value of diamonds and water. Diamonds are highly expensive, but really serve no purpose. Water, which is a critical resource, is incredibly cheap. So it's, something's not working here, and until there's a fundamental rethink, it's going to be difficult to tackle the challenge.
Well, and I'll just add another quote from Benjamin Franklin, since we're quoting great Americans. And, we don't know the worth of water until the well is dry, and that's because if we don't price it, that's exactly right. And so I think we have come to really understand and support the need for really strong and effective, transparent regulation in this sector. And in our SEC 10K, we report water stress, water issues, as a strategic risk to our business. And one of the contributing causes that we point to, and it's in the SEC 10K, you can read it, is poor governance, right? And that's a real issue around the world. And having fair pricing is really critical. I think South Africa probably has one of the most interesting models where it's talking about the human right to water. The Constitution guarantees the right to water at a base level of subsistence. That is baked into their sort of national plan. But then you have tariff structures that kick in above a certain level of service, and I think that kind of reflects the balance of rights-based approach on the part of the government, as well as the letting the marketplace help allocate and really price in where it needs to be priced. We've also, and I'll just touch on this briefly, but through our partnership with the World Wildlife Fund, have engaged, and we're looking at doing more of this, in payment for environmental services. So really looking at upstream users in watersheds and where we have operations. And in Guatemala, we've supported and helped bring together a water fund to invest in watershed conservation upstream, so that the downstream users, ourselves included, will have access to quality water and availability of supply in a way that won't require us to add a whole lot of new capital equipment for filtration to get all the ag runoff out of the water before we put it in our products. So some interesting areas to explore there as well around this sort of valuing natural capital approach.
That example from South Africa that you raise is an important one, I think, to emphasize to folks, because this seems to be where the NGO and the business community are coalescing in terms of what is this human right to water, what does it mean to have a human right to water, that the basic needs that a human being has to water, those should be provided by the community, by government, but that beyond that, people need to pay for water, that we don't need subsidized swimming pools and we don't need subsidized agricultural systems. Now, the power that companies have, like Merck and Coke, in driving change through your supply chain, quantifying and measuring costs, is probably the strongest weapon that we have. But it would seem logical that the political system should step in and say, well, it was okay for water to be free to agriculture 100 years ago or 200 years ago, but now we should be charging something. Why isn't that happening? What's the disconnect that would prevent Congress or the states from simply establishing that you need to compensate the community for community withdrawals of water?
Well, I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, without going to the politics in Washington, which, you know, put that aside for a second. No, there was I mentioned earlier the work that McKinsey did on this Water Resources Group initiative, and it had the International Finance Corporation, Coca-Cola supported it, SAB Miller, Nestle, and a handful of other foundations and companies to kind of create this baseline. And basically what they did was to do for water what they had done in the climate change cost abatement curve, the Vattenfall study, for those of you who follow that issue. And it was really kind of looking at sort of the hydroeconomics, if you will, and you know how to think about water as a productive input in society, and how to begin to think differently about how you would price it or value it, right, in terms of net benefit for human prosperity and ecosystem services. And so this model was rolled out, and it got a lot of attention at the World Economic Forum. Ban Ki-moon got involved, and my boss, Muhtar Kent, the CEO of Coca-Cola, and many others, and drew in fair number of government ministers, et cetera. And the net result is that this is now an actual platform or program within the World Bank Group to provide a much higher level focus within government planning around water resource management. And the idea is that water is too important to be left to the water ministry, fundamentally, that it needs to be the subject of the national planning commissioners, to the finance minister, that this resource ultimately underpins virtually all the prosperity that a nation enjoys or does not. And so to relegate it to a kind of excuse the pun, but a backwater ministry, that not always the most effective, and I'll stop there. It needs to be elevated, and that's what this group is now doing, working in Jordan, in Mexico, in South Africa, in Karnataka State, in India, and some initial discussions in China and Mongolia, to bring about a kind of a higher level policy dialogue that brings together critical stakeholders, including business, as well as the NGO partners, as well as the government folks, to really think through how to solve some of those tough challenges, because they are very hard. And if we do it together, we can do a lot more.
Yeah. And I hope that there are more initiatives like that. I mean, I think that's what needs to happen. I guess in the U.S., I mean, I was surprised after Hillary Clinton made that announcement on World Water Day about water being the next oil crisis, and this, I think the statistic that the prediction that in the future war will be fought not over oil but over water. I was surprised that didn't spur more national debate and discussion. It just kind of went away. And I think in the U.S. anyway, we're not going to see a lot of movement because the public's not adequately informed. It's not something that they're going to, from a grassroots perspective, we just haven't seen the same movement that has been around climate change. And so our politicians just, what's in it for them? And it's cynical and it's too bad, but I think that's where we are right now.
Just another Mark Twain quote: "Whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting."
Maybe just to lead in and add on to that. I mean, here in the U.S. too, one thing I'll say, and it's something to note, I think, about water wherever you are, it's so location specific.
Absolutely.
And so in terms of, here in the U.S., the idea of a national policy is a little bit challenging because water and the value of water and scarcity or relative abundance of water in Arizona, say, as compared to right here in this area, it's really hard to compare. So, that's just a larger observation to note, no matter what aspect of water you're looking at, but certainly when it comes to this question of government and why it might be that we haven't seen more emergence of good government action on the issue. But something I think to note is what drives a lot of the action or absence or challenge of this issue. It's very different, for example, from carbon in terms of action a company might take to abate their emissions. It's so location specific. So it's a lot more complex, I think, in a lot of ways in terms of strategically how companies tackle it as an issue.
And if I could, just to build on Marielle's point, that when we think about the embedded water issue that she raised earlier around supply chain water, I mentioned a liter of Coke is 70 liters. It depends very much on where that sweetener comes from. So if it's rain-fed sugarcane in Sao Paulo, Brazil, that's one thing. If it's coming at the expense of depleting a fossil aquifer, in a highly water-stressed area, that's another thing. So not all water is the same. A liter is not a liter is not a liter, and that's part of the challenge. Is this is very complex and very local, in terms of the real impacts.
Yeah. One of the perennial challenges that we find in the legislative process is that within companies they want to advance sustainability, but in the Congress and in state legislatures there is an understandable priority on those issues that are most relevant to the company's tax and operational continuation. And lobbyists, quite frankly, tell us constantly, well, we can't use any of our chits for this bigger issue. We can't use any of our chits for global climate change, for water pricing and sustainability, because we need to save those chits for the things that are really going to impact our bottom line, or we're violating our fiduciary responsibilities. How do we get out of this cycle where it's so difficult to maneuver a corporate and NGO alliance on behalf of changes that have broad positive public impacts but are only narrowly beneficial to each of those interests?
I think you need to have a few very visionary CEOs like Coke, and I'm forgetting that you're a previous CEO, but who started Neville, who started the CEO Water Mandate, and I think it's going to be very difficult. Not only are companies reticent to use their chits, but they're reticent to be the first in their industry often to go out there and do something. So when you can bring together a consortium of companies like the CEO Water Mandate, which is under the UN Global Compact, and it is really calling on CEOs. Coke's former CEO called our CEO, said, hey, let's work together on this. We signed on, our CEO has called others, and together I think it is one way to go, because it's like, that's a very practical point, and it's life in DC.
How can some of the people in the room begin to change that? Is there anything that the folks here can do in the various careers that they've started or are about to start in this arena?
That's a tough one, Bill.
I was going to say, I'll maybe take that one narrowly. One observation that I might just share is that it's really helpful to, and more rare, I would say, to have people that are able to both speak and understand the science behind some of these environmental issues, and also be able to translate that and speak corporate language or policymaker language. So, one piece of advice that I've tried to take on myself in my education career is to not shy away necessarily from perhaps what you might think of as the harder courses if you're not scientifically inclined, and get a foundational background in that as well, because you'll be more unique and valuable, and also understand, I think, more deeply some of these issues if you've got that basis to filter through everything that's coming at you, and translate that into sound business decisions.
Yeah, I think I'm heartened that there are so many students each year at this conference, because the people in this room are going to be the next wave of executives and leaders at companies, and I think that's critical, because you will get this issue and you will see that it's a risk for the business. I think a challenge that many corporations face is that middle management unless they're in a food company or agriculture, don't get water as a risk. It's just, it hasn't risen to the materiality threshold. And it's hard to make that business case. So the fact that you all already get it will hopefully change those things. The challenge is you need to get in those positions quickly and move up the ladder.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in just a moment. And I'll also say, just as a placeholder, that if you are interested in pursuing careers in this arena, give us your business card. We'd be happy to get you some ideas on how you can make change, whether you're looking to be in a nonprofit, in a for-profit corporation, in government, and elsewhere. So I'd be happy to pass that along. What tools are available to companies to help them to meet their needs and their roles in water?
Okay, I can start. Well, there's actually has been kind of a proliferation of tools, I would say, of late. Probably too many by the words and things that I've heard from a lot of our corporate partners. But a lot of those tools right now surround helping companies get a better idea of what their risks are when it comes to water. So some of the tools are mapping tools to kind of look globally at a company's portfolio of facilities or sourcing regions, for example, and understand, where they might be at higher risk given water shortages, projected water shortages, that kind of thing. One called the Global Water Tool, and another by WRI called Aqueduct are two of those global mapping tools. And then, there are ones that are more site or locally focused. One developed and launched over the past few years by a group called GEMI, the Local Water Tool, is very site-focused at helping a company at the facility level better understand across a range of environmental and economic and social issues what their risks might be related to water. And we've been piloting that with some of our energy sector partners.
What questions do folks in the audience want to ask while we have the opportunity? Yes, and are they supposed to go to the microphones here, or just ask from the? Yell it out. And please tell us who you are and where you're from as well.
I'm Caroline from Yale University. I was actually, prior to Yale, I was working for Senator Cardin on the Water and Wildlife Committee, so I especially appreciate what you said about it's very region specific. But my question has to do with, and you also mentioned the disconnect between people understanding you're not going to have good water infrastructure if you don't pay for it. So how do we make that? How do we help them make that connection? And then my second question is, since you've done a lot of international work, do you guys run up against the same barriers? Do people have trouble making that connection?
The answer is yes. I mean, and I think it's the key issue has really been the agricultural influence, understandable in a lot of countries that in the emerging markets. Take India, for example. Farmers are very important, and so this business of subsidized electricity for them to overpump the aquifers is politically, something that's very challenging to break, because it has to do with the power of the agricultural vote and the support that represents. And you see it in many other countries. That's why this McKinsey WRG Water Resources Group work is so important, I think, because it's beginning to try to say, how do we really counterbalance the political imperative, which is understandable and it's very real and you can't ignore it. It's there. You can't wish it away. But how to think through it in the context of some more disciplined, rational thinking about the future of the economy and how that benefit is going to have to come, and how do you restructure some of that politically.
Yes.
Hi, repeat the question afterwards, or speak into the mic for the recording.
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name's Heather West. I'm from the Yale School of Management and the School of Forestry. And I wanted to go back to something, Marielle, you had mentioned earlier about water footprinting. And I know Professor Hoekstra has done a ton of fantastic work, and makes sense to divide it up into gray, green, and blue water. But that's kind of from a corporation standpoint. I'm wondering, how do we scale that down to someone who's operating in the Colorado River Basin, for example? So like the New Belgiums of the world that have a really big influence on the water that we use, but they don't have the resources that Coca-Cola or Merck have to make that kind of change.
I don't know if I have anything, any particular insights that might help you. I guess all I can say is that you're right, it is a really challenging thing when it comes to the watershed level. I mean, one of the things Hoekstra has done in the Water Footprint Network has done is to also look at the water footprint concept from the vantage point of trade and countries. It's not quite yet, I guess, the watershed level look that I think you'd find perhaps more helpful in that case. That said, I think they've recently launched through the Water Footprint Network a tool, a footprinting tool that, yet another tool, that does take a global look at water footprint. I think it's at a watershed level globally. So that might be something that might illuminate some more insights. It's relatively new, so I think it probably still has a lot of kinks to work out. And I would also add that the water footprint approach, although a very useful methodology, is not without its imperfections too. So in any event, I think that there is movement to start driving down toward the watershed level approach, and that might be one useful to take a look at.
One thing that we're doing, we have as part of this kind of journey on water, we put in place a requirement that every plant operator have a source water protection plan in place in every location that we bottle around the world, which means, and there's a sort of a three-part series of understanding the watershed, engaging with the stakeholders in the watershed, and then putting together a watershed action plan, right, at each plant. And by next year, we will have completed literally all 1,000 plants in 200 countries. And what we're finding is in many, in sort of the emerging developing countries, that we're investing in hydrogeological studies and insights that aren't available from the local government because they just don't have that information. So we're providing that information sharing and open sourcing it. And recently in South Africa, we got a request to knit together all the different pieces that we've done in several of our bottling plants in South Africa to share with the National Planning Commission. So, you know, some of the insights around some of this, certainly not in the Colorado River Basin, because it's pretty well understood, but certainly in other parts of the world where, you know, we're bringing some water expertise to the local community. We're doing everything we can to share that with the local community. Just as we have the aqueduct piece that Marielle mentioned, is all of the water risk mapping data that we generated over 6 years. We gave that IP to WRI to put on their website.
Right. So there's a question right there. And if I can ask that you just come up to the microphones and line up at least a few at a time so that I'll see how many questions we've got and be able to get to you quickly. And also, feel free to have an opinion and provide advice as well as asking questions. This is a conversation, so.
Leading the witness.
Yes.
First, thank you for your presentation. Both Maggie and Jeff mentioned that companies in developing countries implement water sustainability practices and strategies as very core business strategy. And I'm wondering, how do you prioritize the water projects you implemented in those developing countries? Because in those countries, water is a big issue, and I think the problem is so big. A lot of places need water projects like pollution reduction or water saving projects. How do you pick the organizations to work with, and what kind of criteria do you use to prioritize these programs, and how do you evaluate your success and communicate to public finally? Thank you.
Sure, I can start, but I think Jeff is going to have a lot more experience in such. But When we started this, we had to prioritize where we wanted to focus on water. Not to really use an analogy, but we couldn't boil the ocean. There's just so much. Was it water quality? Was it water scarcity? Where were we going to focus? And so we did settle on the WASH issue, and we decided on India. We knew we wanted to start off on a pilot scale and really prove this model. And we chose India for three reasons. One, because it's a critical market for us. Two, because of the immensity of their water challenge. And three, because the government there has recognized the right to water and has taken some pretty good steps. So we knew that we would have a willing partner. And before we go in anywhere, we always work with the government to make sure that it will be sustainable and that they are a bought-in partner. Since we were new to this space, though, we joined with a group in Washington called the Global Water Challenge. And they really helped to bring us up to speed quickly on who the key players were, and who we wanted to work with. And that's actually how we met Coke in India. And some other NGOs as well. And there are a lot of good groups out there, but there are also a lot of good groups who've been doing this for a really long time and they don't have a lot of results. There are a lot of wells out there that no longer work, and so we did a lot of due diligence. In terms of measuring impact, and that's really challenging, we've been working with the London benchmarking group to put together some impact metrics. Not only, kind of outputs of what happens in terms of the number of water stations that are built, but looking at how can we do health impact assessments and actually see if there's a reduction in diarrheal disease, if there's an increase in or a decrease in absenteeism from school. Are there any economic development metrics that we can also track? And we've made a commitment in these partnerships to share those learnings. Being a research-based company, we do a lot of publications. So that's baked into the project.
Yeah, very briefly, because I see a lot of people in line here, it's a combination of local and global. So, because we're a franchise model and we operate in very local, places with local employees, locally owned franchise bottling partners, they really determine the priorities locally, and that's obviously the most effective. This source water protection requirement that I alluded to earlier also drives investment. So when they do this assessment and better understand, watershed ecosystem challenges as well as shared use issues in terms of overpumping of aquifers or what have you, that might drive a program on drip irrigation with the local farmers, or et cetera. So it's really an output of that local source water protection piece. I'm on my way to China tomorrow to talk to our group there about the 12th five-year plan and our partnership with UNDP and how we're going to shape that in order to support where the government of China wants to take this issue, which is a growing issue in China, if you have any insights in that. And then also we have these global partnerships with WWF around 7 major river basins. We have a goal to give back as much water as we use by 2020, to replenish, if you will. So we're working with USAID and other partners on that as well. So it's a top-down and bottom-up kind of marriage of different projects.
I'm going to go to the first in the back, and then go back to the front here. But if I can ask, so that we can serve our audience best, to keep the questions and statements to about 30 seconds or so, and to try to keep the answers to about 1 minute, then we can get through. So yes.
Great. Hi, my name's Emily Taylor. I'm a dual degree student at the Ross School of Business and the School of Natural Resources and Environment at Michigan. And so my question is, we've talked about the difference between carbon and water, and namely the global versus local and the context there. And, so my question really is, companies have done a lot. Some companies have been really pioneering in doing work on carbon, so internal carbon pricing, trading, shadow pricing, things like that. Are there some lessons that we can glean from that work, even though carbon is different from water fundamentally, and apply it to water before there ever becomes a global price for water? And so what can companies do now to create an internal incentive and market-based approach to reducing water usage? Thank you.
I'm sure my corporate counterparts probably have some ideas. I'll just draw your attention really quickly to the work of one company that I'm aware of that is trying the shadow pricing concept with water internally, and that's Rio Tinto. So that might be a good place to look to see what results come out of that. I think it's relatively nascent, but it is an idea that is being trialed, so it'll be interesting to see how it works out for them.
Any other?
Yeah, we don't have an internal trading system per se, but we did just achieve a 20% improvement. We set that goal in '04 to be 20% more water efficient by 2012, and we achieved that, and we're setting another goal. This is just for production water, not supply chain. And we have this replenish target. And obviously, we're not going to replenish water in Portland, Oregon, where it rains 300 days a year, but we're going to over-replenish, if you will, in Rajasthan, India, because it's an arid area, and there's a lot of opportunity to drive real benefit. So we'll be, in some cases, doing 2x or 3x what we use in terms of giving back in that. So there's a bit of an internal mechanism there.
Right. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tracy. I'm from Hull International Business School. My concern is, how are business leaders working with governments to avoid corruption as the governments are selling water rights to corporations, especially if events continue to occur due to climate change, and therefore there could be even less access to clean water?
How do we work with governments to?
Yeah, how are leaders working with business leaders working with the governments, and even within the organization itself? I mean, the governments are selling water rights to corporations, but how are corporations going to work with governments to help prevent this potential possibility of corruption, especially if there's less access to water, if there's an occurrence of less access to water, and corporations now have the rights to waters? How can you prevent corruption from happening? Starting now, as they're selling these water rights to.
Well, we can't dictate to governments. I mean, that's they dictate to us. So it's the other way around, I think, is part of the challenge. I mean, obviously, strict adherence to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is top of mind. I mean, that's something that we take very seriously and train everybody on globally, rigorously. We support and articulate in whatever forums we can the importance of fair, transparent, and effective regulation, because that's the level playing field in which we want to be able to compete. If we don't have that, then it really does, you get a lot of conspiracy theory about what companies are doing. We want to pay a fair price. We want to be a full partner, with civil society and government in addressing these water challenges. So we just make that point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's you got to work around these issues carefully, but working with organizations like Transparency International, Ethics Resource Center, who can be good advocates when there are those practices going on.
Yeah. And I'll just add one more thing. It's interesting to have the vantage point of an NGO, but I think a lot of change has happened in terms of, at least with U.S.-based companies, the adherence to the FCPA rules, and we actually, as an NGO partner of companies like Coke and Merck, have to be trained in that as well now, which is a big difference to when we started off this work. So, I mean, I think there is some positive movement afoot that will help, minimize. Of course, these are U.S.-based companies that are based in other parts of the world. It might take longer to get there.
Question in the back.
Hi, Brooke Beadle from Novellus. We're an aluminum rolling company and recycling. I wanted to know, I've heard a lot of claims about companies claiming to want to become water neutral, similar to the concept of carbon neutral, but if you all could just speak to that and whether or not that's really an effective way to address our water issues. Is that really something we should aim for, or more is really just focusing on reductions and efficiencies?
So we have a goal. We call it replenish. We don't call it water neutral, but it is to give back as much water as we use by 2020. We're at 36% today. We knew that if we just simply claimed that, it would not be credible. So we worked over a 2.5-year period with the Nature Conservancy and a whole host of other, the Water Footprint Network in the UK, Nestle, a host of others, to establish a methodology which has now been peer-reviewed around how would you count this, right? Sort of like the clean development mechanism. What counts? You know, what's additional? And how long do you count it? Do you count it forever? Do you count it for a year? So we've actually, there's now a methodology for how a company could actually measure water in versus what are we doing in the form of rainwater harvesting, drip irrigation, reforestation, safe water access, you know, community access to safe drinking water. How do you begin to quantify those benefits giving back to nature and communities so that we're offsetting the water that we are using, right? So it's a kind of the more we use, the more we give back ethic. And we're on track to achieve 100% of that by 2020. Is it enough? Probably not, but it certainly gives us a discipline and a framework to work within on a global basis as a franchise to make sure that we're giving back as much as we use.
How many other companies have joined in that?
Several others have picked up on it. Yeah.
I would just say that we've seen a step away from that concept of water neutrality. I think it's dangerous for some of the reasons that we've mentioned about water being so location specific for a global company to make that global level commitment. I mean, the challenge for us, you know, from our vantage point as an environmental NGO is, you know, where you really want to see the positive results is in each watershed, you know. So if a company's having an impact on that watershed, we want to see, you know, such as the way Coke structured their commitments, that, you know, the input back into be at that watershed level. So I think Water Footprint Network actually came out with a paper in addition perhaps to that methodology that tackles that topic.
Hi, my name is Tim Letts. I'm a MBA student at NYU Stern School of Business. My question is, we've heard a lot about the potential consequences of water scarcity in the next 50 years if we don't solve this problem. Given that it's such a location-specific issue, what do you think the early warning signs would be 10 or 20 years out that we are failing to address the issue? Where might we see the crisis start to unfold first, and what events do you think would cause the consumer or the citizen to become more aware of this and demand action?
I think we're already starting to see the signs. I'm trying to come up with a good example. I mean, I think not only in the water scarcity, but just with the, you know, the unpredictable weather patterns we've had over the past few years. We've had disruption in our supply chain in France. I think it was last year they had their flooding. We had manufacturing facilities closed down for a week because we couldn't discharge because of the floods, and we couldn't get our trucks through. So, you know, that and it was a critical factory supplying life-saving medicines that was shut down, and I don't think that ever happened before in the history. And you know, from a CEO perspective, that got on the radar. But you know, maybe, perhaps Jeff or Marielle, you have other examples, but I think the signs are already out there.
I would concur. Thailand's another great example recently where there was a lot of flooding. I think it was last year that basically shut down the whole supply chain related to computers and to certain microchips that were being produced there. I can't remember the name of the company, but I guess the question is that you sort of alluded to, you know, is that going to inspire or spur what we, you know, as conservationists think is the necessary action? And jury's still out on that, but I can bet as soon as a company sees some hit to their supply chain, at least at that company level, you'll see the response start to take place.
It's a great question. I think there's a germ of a big idea there, which is, do we need an early warning system that we could all agree on? Because I think, you know, right now it's anecdotal, and therefore it doesn't really get the kind of traction, perhaps, that it needs to in the policy arena and with others. But you know, in addition to, as Maggie mentioned, the agricultural disruptions, whether it was the 3 or 4 years ago in Australia, where you know you saw the incredible drought in the Murray-Darling Basin, with impact on wheat prices, the corn price volatility in the U.S., the wheat harvest in Russia. I mean, you know, the list goes on. All of this is totally consistent with what the science of climate change suggests is going to occur with increasing frequency. And the big challenge is the volatility of it, right, the unpredictability of it. But you're also seeing it in the energy sector. So, you know, during 3 years or so ago, there were during the drought in the southeast, there were several thermoelectric power plants that were just about to go dark because they didn't have enough cooling water available in the inflow in the rivers. So you're beginning to see that. We've seen some of that in South Africa in the past. But all of these, you know, we need a sort of an energy and ag water kind of indicator dashboard for the planet that would say these are things that are happening, and look at the frequency with which they're increasingly happening. Time for action.
That sounds like a good project for an MBA student.
I think so.
Thank you. Terrific. In the back.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Stewart. I'm an undergrad at University of New Mexico, and I know that there is a lot of controversy about GMOs and whatnot, but you can't deny that they do feed people, and that they have been formulated lately so that they aren't as water intensive. And so I guess my question is, what specific agricultural practices are being put into place to conserve water, not just in terms of GMOs and like corn and wheat and everything, but also in terms of the beef industry, which is really water intensive.
Mm-hmm. Great question.
I don't have the beef. I don't know.
Where is the beef?
That's the beef.
That's terrible.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the GMO aspect of that. Yeah, I mean, beef in the Amazon, for example, is a huge impact area that we're concerned about. And I know, for example, that McDonald's is starting to tackle that issue because a lot of their beef is sourced from the Brazilian. Well, they made the commitment to stop sourcing from that area because of some of their concerns. So that's the best I can do to try and tackle your question.
But it is, I think, an area that is increasingly a part of the climate adaptation challenge, right? Mm-hmm. Which is how do we figure out how to adapt to a climate change world where these impacts around water are going to be. Our India business provided a grant to ICRISAT in India to support drought-resistant crop research, because that's going to be increasingly important for Indian agriculture, which is at risk due to climate change. So I think those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about increasingly.
Certainly the efficiencies that can come about through genetic modification and in other ways, you can certainly extrapolate the importance of those, and there are many people in the environmental and conservation community as well as the business community that are that look favorably toward GMOs because of those efficiency impacts. There are others who are extremely concerned for other reasons. One of the challenges that we face is we clearly need efficiency across the board in resource use, and the price system can drive a lot of efficiency if we actually wake up and use prices to do so. On the other hand, if we maintain subsidies of key industries in the process and we don't take account of externalities, then the efficiencies that we gain will simply allow the economy to grow bigger, more people to be born, and a bigger crisis at the end of the line. And so it becomes a political question: how do you change in a political system where the power goes to the status quo and the last status quo? Those are the interests that tend to dominate because it's easier to stop change than to start change. How do you start change to tweak the economy so that you don't have subsidies that lead to beef and farm practices that are founded on waste? And so it becomes a political question and a difficult question for any company to answer. Yes.
Hi, my name is Matthew Thomas. I'm with McKinsey & Company and also the Executive Director of Tri-Sector Forum. Water scarcity is a great example of a tri-sector issue, an issue that requires the public, private, and nonprofit sectors to collaborate. And we're reflecting at the firm on what's the leadership model of the 21st century to address these issues better. And we're studying something called tri-sector athletes, people that are able to engage and collaborate across the three sectors. And when looking at these folks, we've seen that a lot of them have worked in different sectors in the past. And Jeff, just reflecting on your bio, you've worked in the Clinton administration, you sit on numerous nonprofit boards, and I'm just specifically wondering, has those experiences helped you at Coke and address these particular issues? And if you can be specific, what skills did you pick up that you're able to apply and reflect for the rest of the panel as well?
Yeah, no, well, thanks for the question. I mean, the answer is yes, absolutely. And when I came to Coke, one of the most impactful statements that was made to me, I went back to Washington and visited with a former colleague at USAID, where I worked for many years, and he had just come back as mission director from Rwanda. And he said, we had lunch, and he said, David Hess was his name, and he said, I was director of AID in Rwanda for 4 years, he said, and I would see the Coke guys, Hutus and Tutsis, at these ambassador things on the 4th of July and what have you, and I could never figure out how to do a partnership with them, but I knew if I did it with them, it would work, whatever it was, because they're here, they're local, they're well-trained, they're professionals, they know how to get stuff done, and they're not going to let it fail. If they take up a task, they're going to get it done. They're local. But he said, I never could figure it out. He said, your greatest asset are your bottlers around the world, and their localness and their ability to deliver. There's a lot of money in the world looking for good projects, but don't know how to get results. And he said, that's what you need to leverage. And I thought, wow, David, that's a really good insight. And I got back to Coke. Well, today, of these 400 projects that we have around the world, we have about $250 million at work on water-related projects. 2/3 of that is coming from non-Coca-Cola sourcing funds, from AID, from the French Development Agency, from the Gates Foundation. But we're bringing local presence and dollars. I mean, we're putting skin in the game as well. But we're hopefully trying to be a catalyst, right, in that sort of sense of development catalyst that I learned at USAID. So a lot of those lessons about partnering and finding ways to really be catalytic and bringing about change, I think translated. It also made it easier because when we started, part of this partnership we have on water with AID, it started with me, and we now have about $40 million worth, I think the largest sort of public-private partnership with USAID. It would have been very difficult, given the transaction costs in the early days, to get through that if I hadn't had the experience with USAID and knew who to go to and how to work to make it happen. Because, I mean, most business people would probably bridle at the sheer volume of bureaucratic red tape involved. So, I think having been in both camps really helped me cross-fertilize ideas and relationships. And increasingly, so we have a huge partnership now called Every Drop Matters with the UN Development Program. It's run out of Istanbul by Kadri Ozan, who is in our Eurasia Africa business, former UNDP guy, came into Coke, and he brings that. So I think I'm a big fan of the revolving door, and I think all of you in this room, I hope you have the benefit in your careers, and I imagine many of you will, of working across that tri-sector, because I think it really does bring real strengths to the cause.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I haven't had the opportunity to work on the nonprofit side, but I think we've seen a shift, at least within Merck, in the last, I would say, probably even less than 5 years, where we are doing a lot more hiring of people from NGOs because we realize they bring a different skill set. They help us think in other ways. So, I mean, we're in the health sector looking at care, looking at Population Services International, looking at the Gates Foundation, and 5 years ago that wouldn't have been our traditional way of hiring. So,
yes, in the back.
I'll try to make this quick. My name is Alana Bohm. I'm from Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. My question goes back to kind of some of the opening comments about the fear of water conflict and in some of these countries that have mentioned in Hillary Clinton's comment. What do you guys see as the role of the private sector in terms of helping to mitigate some of these conflicts, and what kind of investments have you seen as priorities in order to help mitigate or bring stability to some of these areas? Thank you.
Well, I mean, in terms of pre-conflict, engagement, I think, if it's reached a crisis point, then it's probably too late to stop a conflagration from occurring. So it's really about addressing, not the acute crisis, but the chronic crisis, and that's the greatest antidote, to allowing these things to fester and become a real conflict. We're very familiar, and Bill mentioned some work that we're doing in Sudan. But the work in some of the most challenging circumstances in helping provide safe water access and sanitation, which has gender impacts in terms of girls in school and relieving women of the burden of fetching water and the security risks associated with that, and the whole cycle of development. I think that it's all part of trying to ignite that, and that's really the hope. I mean, because it's the lack of that development that actually creates the conditions for conflict and instability. So I think water is a force for peace. We just need to do more of it and get on with it.
I think the other thing that companies can do, again, in a proactive way, is to lend their skills and capabilities when it's appropriate to government. So obviously not usurp the government's responsibility to provide water, but to the extent we can help them build water management systems or put in place proper governance. And that's something we've found we've been able to contribute to in some places, in some countries that were open to that.
And I might just jump in. This is more from a previous life than from my work at CI, but have done some research and work on this issue of water and conflict. And I guess my observation would be it's a popular thing to say that the next war will be fought over water, but my observation and experience is that it's more often a resource over which collaboration tends to happen. And so, I mean, I guess just bear that in mind, and I think that where we're seeing movement with the private sector is towards these more collaborative approaches. So I don't think it's all gloom and doom, and without hope, I actually see water as an issue through which a lot of really strong collaborative efforts are taking shape.
If you haven't seen the CDP report that came out this week, the theme of it is collective action, and it's exactly that theme, and there are a lot of good examples, so take a read of that.
I want to thank our panelists, and I want to particularly thank and congratulate the folks that are here in the, I hesitate to say audience, because you really are the featured presenters here. When I look at folks that are relatively young in their careers in this area, I think of 10 years and 20 years and 30 years and longer, and the extraordinary potential you have to drive change. And I know that the people in this room, you're going to drive amazing change in the course of your lives. And the earlier that you can understand the nature of change and how you participate in the process to drive change, the more successful in that process you will be. In our work at Future 500 in bringing together these often opposing forces, we find that we have allies that we've never imagined and power that we've never used in most of the issues that we work. And that if you can understand the interplay between the activist community that puts issues on the table and drives those issues, sometimes with anger, sometimes with demonization, but with passion behind it. The role that corporate change agents play within companies to raise issues, to take energy from the activist community and use it to drive change. And those communities together in an area that they certainly underdeveloped so far, when activists and companies can come together to drive change in public policy and go together to government to drive the changes that are needed in the overall framework in which economic growth and prosperity happens, the change can be overwhelming. The change will happen. The only question is at what pace it will happen and whether it takes crises to make it happen or not. And the people in this room, you're the ones that will decide. When people ask me, what do I think is going to happen with climate, with water, with any other set of issues, I always wonder why people think it's something that is just dictated by God. You know, maybe it is, but I think that you and we make the choice as to whether we're going to be successful in this area, not by demonizing, not by following scripts that we're supposed to follow, but by understanding how power works and using it with integrity to drive the kind of change that we're proud of. So I appreciate the work that all of you folks are doing. I encourage you to continue it and dive in. Thank you very much. Great. Thank you.